Okay, everyone, welcome to the presentation on World War I and the crisis of the European global order. This is chapter 28 in your text. With the presentation, I'm just going to give kind of a brief background on chapter 28, kind of go into the chapter itself, synthesize some of the big ideas. This will serve as kind of a review for some of the ideas on World War I, the main causes of war, the things that you'll want to remember for the AP test and beyond. Um, you'll notice in your textbook there are really two chapters devoted to war, and we've talked about a lot of battles, a lot of conflicts, and we haven't spent a lot of time on them because AP World History doesn't spend a lot of time on the battles. It's and war in general, it's mostly about the changes that come from it. So part of what we're looking at this point as we move into the contemporary era are the triggers for change, some of the continuities, and some of the biggest changes. So some things to remember from the transition from the modern era to the contemporary era is that World War I is oftentimes the date, 1914, that's set up that essentially triggers the change, the massive change. You have coming after World War I a worldwide depression, and then of course World War II. These are major factors, and they're major triggers for the change in the contemporary era. European dominance was questioned, it was threatened, former colonies challenged Western military supremacy. You have a framework provided by the Cold War. The Soviet Union collapses. The United States emerges as the sole world power. This brings us into the contemporary age as recent as today. Um, Technological change is profoundly affects life. That's what we see especially during World War I. The destructive power of weaponry grows, the nature of warfare grows, civilians increase, genocide was frequent. Population growth made it possible by the 19th century improvements in healthcare. All of these things are part of what we run across in the contemporary age. Some of the big changes to remember with World War I and beyond. You have political changes that are substantial. You have aristocracies being replaced. Some instances they're replaced by totalitarian governments, elsewhere by democracies. We see the rise in fascism coming right after World War I, for example. Economically, a lot of countries follow the West in terms of industrialization. We've talked about that already. Oil producing countries play a new role in world events. China and India transform themselves into major exporters. Nationalism, Marxism, consumerism comprise the secular forces. They have the greatest influence on our culture. Religion continues to play a vital role at this time, especially as we see the rise in fundamentalist groups and evangelical groups around the world, especially in the United States, and then fundamentalist groups forming in Islam. Globalization continues, especially in the latter half of the 20th century. This period is considerably more intense, and we're talking about 60s, 70s, and 80s. In terms of globalization, as China, Russia, Japan, Germany, and the US all play key roles. And then, of course, environmental change becomes global, with the products of one nation affecting others far, far away. Some of the continuities that we find, there's three areas specifically. Some countries continue to produce raw materials and goods in low-cost ways. Gender roles are influenced by changes in other spheres, but pressure for change was countered in many areas of resistance. You also have cultural change that's resisted by the efforts to underline native culture. You have a lot of traditional movements, especially in terms of fundamentalism. And then governments in some cases react to change by insisting on their rights. One example, the United States remains hostile to what it views as infringements of sovereignty in matters of the environment, punishment of war criminals, and the banning of things like landmines. These are all different types of things that we'll see and that we'll encounter as we move through this time period. Now, getting into chapter 28 and World War I and this crisis on order, one thing that we have, World War I is often thought as the principal turning point for the 20th century and for world history. You have global dominance quickly results in the spread of conflict. One question that is open, could World War I have been prevented? Most of the theories state that a conflict was inevitable. It just so happened that World War I was that conflict. If it had not happened, would there have been something to replace it? Most historians think yes. In 1914, Europe, for example, was divided into two rival alliance systems. So getting into kind of the causes of World War I before we talk about this long march up to war and then eventually outbreak of war, we'll start with the main causes of World War I. This is a great slide to remember, especially if you ever have an essay to write on World War I or just to remember the main causes. If you can remember the acronym MAIN, M-A-I-N, remember things like militarism. You have these industrial technologies, you have nations beginning to create more weapons. Then you have the alliances that I just talked about. You have the Triple Alliance or the Central Powers. That's Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy initially. Italy is, there's some issues going on with Italy in terms of the way they're responded to. For example, they're marginalized within this alliance, so they end up joining the Triple Entente in 1915. Then you have the Triple Entente. This is the Allied powers of Russia, France, Britain, and Italy in 1915, plus Japan and the US, which enters the war in 1917, so it's a little bit later. The I stands for imperialism. We've talked a lot about the rise of imperialism, and tensions are high at this point between these alliance systems. You have rivalries that are going on. Colonists acted as resource providers and combatants. Then you have finally the N, which is nationalism. You have, for example, in New Germany, you have Balkan independence, which proves to be kind of this trouble spot that creates the outbreak of war. Just a map for you to take a look at as I talk a little bit about that long march to war. Study the map. Take a look at the neutral nations, the Allied trusts, the Triple Entente, the Central Powers. What we have here is a fear of Germany. The fears of Germany that caused this alliance between Russia, France, and Britain. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, of course, allies. They're the Central Powers until Italy joins the other alliance, the Triple Entente in 1915. This system was created by global rivalries between these members. Much of it comes down to things coming from imperialism and colonialism. Most of the world had been claimed by one or the other powers by 1900. We've discussed that in terms of splitting apart China for trade, in terms of the scramble for Africa at the latter part of the 19th century. You then have a costly arms race that begins to develop, and in particular, Germany's creation of a powerful navy that threatens Britain's control of the seas. We know how Britain feels about the seas and controlling certain ports. We discussed that especially with China. With this threat comes new tensions that arise in Europe. The nations use military and often diplomatic measures to diffuse social tensions, but again, diplomatic measures only went so far, and there was a conflict that was inevitable, and many believe that to be the case. For the outbreak of war, the Balkans, as we've discussed, they become this dangerous trouble spot where rival nations contested and where the great powers had specific interests. In July of 1914, you have the assassination of the Austrian Archduke by a Serbian nationalist. Here we have the names, and then of course it leads to the July crisis of 1914, where Austria-Hungary demands political and territorial concessions from Serbia, and Serbia refuses. So Austria-Hungary invades Serbia. Russia at this point supports Serbia, and this is because of the Pan-Slavic movement. It's a movement in the 19th century that's supported by Russia. Its aims at unifying the Slavic people. They had been ruled by others, but it's this unification. Unification has become popular by this point, and it stems back from the unification of both Italy and Germany in 1871. Germany supports Austria-Hungary, and this is the point where alliances begin to fall into place. So no longer is there a possibility of regional war. Instead, you have these strong alliances that are beginning to take shape. So on the Western Front, Germany's main concern is they want to fight war on both fronts. You have the Auxiliary Service Law of 1916. This is a German law that requires all males to only work at jobs that are critical to the war effort. And then you have the Schlieffen Plan. This is the plan that sets up an attack on France first, going through Belgium before they turn east and backward and slow Russia. Britain protects the ally Belgium, and Japan supports Britain. So you guys remember the video that we watched on Japan? Go back and watch it. It kind of shows the support that's taking place at this point in a humorous way for during World War I. The Europeans at this point thought the war would be fairly quick, but Germany didn't have a quick victory in France. In fact, the Western Front Germans halted by the French on the Marne River, and this is where we see the rise of trench warfare. This is ensued along the Western Front, and it lasts for 3 years. The new technology that's being used are airplanes, tanks, poisonous gas, and radio technology. Those become a huge component of World War I. In terms of war outside of Europe, the only place that's not truly affected in some way, shape, or form is South America. It doesn't participate in war. It still sees the effects in terms of materials, in terms of trade, economically, it will see the effects, but it doesn't participate. Troops are recruited from different colonies, and mostly they fight with the Triple Entente. And it primarily occurs when Europeans figure out that war is not going to be decisive and quick. They finally figure out that this is going to be a long-lasting war. Germany's main support was the Ottoman Empire, but we've talked about the Ottomans. They've been in decline for several years at this point. Remember, by the end of the 19th century, they're thought to be the sick man of Europe. They enter World War I in 1915, and then you have the Gallipoli campaign from 15 to 16. The British and French try to capture Istanbul, and this fails. There's massive casualties on both sides, but it's seen as a huge success for the Ottomans. But as we know, it's not something that could potentially save the Ottoman Empire. You have British naval blockades. They ensured Germany could not receive raw materials, so they're cutting off economy and trade from the colonies. German ships are destroyed at this point. And then you have the British dominions of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. They aid in contributing resources to Great Britain. Finally, China declares war on Germany in 1917. So at this point, you see worldwide that, again, other than South America, most places are involved directly or indirectly through supplying troops or some kind of fighters or raw materials for the war, especially if they were colonies of those fighting in the war. And then, of course, the United States, we'll talk about, they enter the war in 1917 as well. So I'm going to pause for a moment, and I'd like you to take a look at the quick review questions. You might want to pause the video itself. And as you look at these review questions, make sure that you can answer them with or without your notes, better without. These could potentially be review questions that could show up on your quiz. You'll have one more quiz, kind of a textbook reading quiz over World War I and World War II. And it'll be more of a short response quiz, so these could be questions on there. So I'll take a moment as you pause the video and try and answer the following 3 questions. Okay, so the war in East and in Italy. First of all, you have Russia focusing back on Austria-Hungary and Eastern Germany, but they're defeated by the German troops. Part of this has to do with some of the tensions that are going on at home. You have aristocratic generals. They command millions of illiterate and poorly trained peasants. We know what the state of Russia is by this point, especially after the assassination of Alexander II. You see new political tensions growing. It's the end of serf labor back in 1861, and finally you have these peasants that are poorly trained because it's a short amount of time to try and industrialize Russia. This helps lead to those class tensions that you have an outbreak of revolution in 1917. This is Russia. Lenin withdraws from World War I early and signs the Treaty of the Brest-Litovsk. And this is cedes Russian territory to the Germans. So they step out. A big reason for that, again, is of course the internal tensions happening in Russia at this time. Finally, in 1915, Austria-Hungary crushes Serbia. They struggle against Russia. You have inept generals. You have the British and French troops being deployed to stop Austrian advance east. And also in 1915, this is the date that the Italians switch from the Triple Alliance to the Triple Entente. And it's partially because British promises territory gains. This is one of the issues that lead to the interwar years and the rise of fascism that we'll see with Mussolini. It's one of those British promises, and most promises that took place during this time never come to fruition. Most of the Entente Italian assaults against Austria-Hungary ended in disaster. Italy was frustrated, and they didn't receive additional territory. So again, it's one of those promises that never came about. For American involvement, you have Americans, they sell food, weapons, and they gave loans to the Entente. This is one time period for the American involvement specifically that that you begin to see their involvement on a global scale financially. Remember, we've talked about the small, the United States being kind of a small contributor to world affairs and global history prior to essentially Matthew Perry in 1853 tapping at the door of Japan saying, "Open your port." After that point, you begin to see American involvement in global affairs take a different shape and form. World War I changes this specifically, especially in a financial way, an economic way, by giving loans to the Entente. In 1915, you have the German submarine that sank the British luxury liner. 100 plus Americans died, and this is part of what led to the argument at home whether or not Americans should become involved in World War I. The Germans claim they were carrying secret shipments, the submarine, and Britain, of course, denies it, but it's later proven to be true. In 1916, Germany attacks U.S. merchant ships, and Germany declares unrestricted submarine warfare. In 1917, and if there's time this week, I'll give you the telegram to kind of decode, but you have the Zimmermann telegram. Great Britain intercepts this telegram where Germany promises Mexico territory it had lost in the Mexican-American War in exchange for joining Germany. Again, we'll try and take a look at the telegram and decode it if there's time this week. So in 1917, the United States enters World War I. Their policy previous to this was isolation. And by 1918, millions of American men were in training. They make Germany believe they need to end the war quickly. And this will be the turn of the tide. Again, U.S. troops are freshly ready, newly armed with supplies. And of course, we know that World War I essentially comes to an end in 1918. We talked about that with the poet Wilfred Owen, who dies just a few days before armistice, or a few weeks rather before armistice. On the home fronts, a few other things taking place at this time. 1918, you have the Spanish flu epidemic. The Spanish flu epidemic kills millions. And you also have governments that deploy propaganda. Propaganda becomes a major part of the war effort, both in World War I and World War II. They promote patriotism, almost to the point of jingoism. They promote citizen support for the war. Some of them are strange. If you take a look at World War I propaganda, they don't make a lot of sense. The soldiers did feel unsupported. They thought citizens weren't all in. They didn't have commitment and an understanding of what was happening. British and Americans, they were bombarded with stories of German atrocities. This is the start to a campaign that would last for several decades. You have many aspects of industrialization. They were taken over by the government in order to fuel the war. People either benefited or they were excluded, and this helps spark at home in places, especially here in the United States, it sparks labor protests. We also see it in Great Britain. Women participate greatly on the home front, and some of those are under the guise of protests for industrialization and labor protests, which turn into movements for the right to vote. We've already talked about some of the earliest areas that achieved the right to vote in 1918, places like Great Britain and Ireland. The end of the war. After Russia withdraws, you have Germany. They transfer soldiers to the Western Front. A newly arrived American soldiers stalled German advance into France. You have the Austro-Hungarian Empire that they abdicated, and finally German commanders agreed to an armistice November 11th, 1918. Overall, in terms of death toll, World War I claims 15 million and it wounds 20 million more. You have a young generation that's nearly wiped out. This leads in the United States, I'm sure you discussed in U.S. history, things like the Lost Generation movement. Bombs and troops had destroyed cities, towns, and farms, and it's a new way of looking at life. World War I essentially changes in the Western world the way of looking at life, the way of looking at relationships. You start to see movements toward surreal reality towards existentialist questions. And this is part of what World War I ends up doing culturally and artistically. So I'm going to pause here again, and I have two questions for you. Try to see if you could respond to these using the notes, and just pause the video briefly as you respond. What events pushed America to enter World War I, and what did governments try to keep the focus on the home front? So coming back to chapter 28, we're going to kind of breeze through again just a couple ideas that you're familiar with already from your exposure in U.S. history. But we'll start with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points in 1918. This is the statement declaring that World War I was a moral affair. It was a proposal for European peace. The 14 post-war goals are listed below. They're things like free trade. It sets up the League of Nations. It's the creation of Poland, a withdrawal of Central Powers from occupied territories, and it's an idea of self-determination, the right of people in a region to determine if they want to be independent or not, leading to more of a rise of nationalism, and eventually independent states, which some claim would help lead to things like fascism. It becomes the basis for the terms of the German surrender. And I'm sure you know that Wilson was awarded the 1919 Nobel Prize for his effort on the 14 points. We can look back at these 14 points and again, hopefully if there's time, it's on my website now, but if there's time, we'll read an article that states many of these 14 points help lead to the tensions that exist in the interwar years, which will eventually lead to World War II. Finally, you have the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. It's the meeting of the Entente leaders to determine peace terms. The outcome is the Treaty of Versailles, which we'll get to in a moment. You have the Austro-Hungarian Empire is dissolved, and is dissolved specifically into Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire is reduced to the present-day Turkey. We already discussed the creation of Turkey in 1923. I think that was part of the chapter as well. Russia loses territory to Poland and Romania. Then you have Finland, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. They receive independence from Russia. Wartime promises of independence of colonial leaders in return for their war support from Entente were forgotten. And again, many of those promises that happened during World War I are completely forgotten. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Germany was given no part in the drafting of the treaty. This helps lead to, again, the tensions that we see in the rise for the interwar years. Because most of the reason and the goal for the Treaty of Versailles was to cripple Germany. So you have the reparations, you cripple Germany economically so it could never again rise to power. One thing we'll talk about is hyperinflation that Germany deals with in the interwar years. The major players disagreed how to deal with it, but the outcome was this. You have Article 231. This is the clause that included total blame for the war on Germany. It limits their army to 100,000 soldiers. You have territory that's returned to France, and they must pay $33 billion in reparations. They eventually lose all their colonies, and the League of Nations is established, which, as you know, it's the idea of U.S. president, but the U.S. never actually joins. It's proposed by Wilson, and it's part of those 14 points. Many of the nations, U.S. was not the only one, but many of the nations refused to join. England and France were hesitant. Germany and Russia were not allowed, and the U.S. declines completely. This is the precursor for the United Nations, which we'll talk about when we get to World War II. It's effective because it functions. It provides famine relief, refugee issues, but it's weak in terms of global affairs and diplomatic relations. Some of the cultural ramifications that we see. Again, I discussed this, mentioned it a little bit. You have the pointlessness of war, optimism of the La Belle Epoque has ended. Art, cinema, poems, literature respond. Russia, for example, one of their most famous films, Battleship Potemkin, becomes huge at this time. We'll actually take a look at the clip of that film. You have writers. They're especially writers that fought in the war, poets like Wilfred Owen who died in war. You have letters that soldiers sent to loved ones. They wrote poems in the trenches. You have a spread of liberal reforms like education. Soldiers' experiences began to be preserved, and then finally you have the lost generation. This term, by the way, was popularized by Hemingway, and it refers to those that moved away from the United States, moved to Paris, people like Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein. Hemingway, if you've read any of his novels, which I'm sure many of you have, it captures the essence of the lost generation in World War One, especially the loss of masculinity in war with death. Artists transfer from romanticism to modernism, and this is the modern movement, which again takes into account things like surrealism, theater of the absurd, existentialism. These types of things are being explored in the 1920s and 30s. I'll just give you a moment to read through this quotation from Samuel Hines, who's a historian about the lost generation. And in terms of after effects of World War I, I'm going to pause here just again for another moment. If you want to pause the video, there's a few quick review questions, 3 of them to be exact. Take a look at them, see if you can answer them with the use of your notes or with what's in your head. Okay, so we're going to pick up with another portion of the chapter, and this portion specifically talks about European imperialism that begins to weaken. In order to kind of win support of these elites, especially Western educated elites and the Allies, you have the French and British who make a lot of promises for these colonial relationships, especially promise of independence. War begins to cast a doubt on white racial supremacy. If you'll remember, we talked about the white man's burden and this concept of racial supremacy at the turn of the century. It's especially evident in things like the white man's burden in dealing with the Congo, the Belgian Congo in Africa. We see this in books like Heart of Darkness rather. The war gives support to anti-colonial movements, and this is what you see especially happening in a place like India. A lot of this resistance was led by charismatic Western educated elites, and they weren't popular at first. But you see this mix of violent protests versus fairly pacifist protests. Again, we'll talk about India. You have India's National Congress Party. This is the party that led India to independence, and it was formed by Indians in 1885. And it was an educated political club. It was supported by British officials, but that was mostly to appease those educated political elite, many of whom were trained in the West and especially in Great Britain. The NCP gave Indians this sense of an identity, and they were concerned over the British Raj, specifically racism and budget. They were concerned with taxation, especially things like the salt tax that Gandhi would eventually lead a protest march regarding. India contributed to World War I, but it was as a colony of Great Britain. So wartime inflation, it begins to affect the population, and this leads to some of these questions and concerns that come about in the 1920s. British leaders, of course, promise Indian self-government. Some steps were taken, but overall they were weak steps, and they were mostly done to appease those that questioned or spoke out. You have the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909. This is done before the war. It provides Indians opportunities to vote and serve on all Indian legislative councils. Then you have the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919, right after the war, and this gives a little bit of increased control for Indian legislators. Then you have the Rowlatt Act of 1919, which restricts Indian civil rights in terms of freedom of the press, to root out conspirators. It's fueled by local protest, and again, this is one of those reforms that really leads to the Indians thinking the British don't have their best interests at heart, and much of what was done before was simply done as PR. 1919, the protests lead to the Amritsar massacre, which we'll talk a little bit about when we discuss India at a little bit more depth. You have the emergence of Gandhi in 1919. He emerges as kind of a local leader. First of all, in 1919, he preaches nonviolence but aggressive protest. This is done through peaceful protests, boycotts, strikes, demonstrations. It eventually would lead to his policy, which comes about and we'll discuss at more detail later on as well. He builds up a strong following, and he combines Western educated ideas about the law with Hindu values. This leads to kind of this popular support with Gandhi in general. You have nationalist protests that surge in the 20s and 30s, and again, we'll discuss this at a little bit more length when we discuss some of these protests that take place. We'll do that to kind of pair it with some of the genocides that are taking place, like the Armenian genocide, for example. A couple more quick review questions. Take a look at these, make sure that you can answer them. Now, the one last thing that your textbook talks about, and we'll talk about Egypt in a moment, I don't want to let this pass by because, discussing Gandhi, I think because Gandhi is such a global figure and has become almost mythical in discussion of Gandhi and his pacifism, we also do see the rise of militant nationalism, and that's happening in places like India as well. Leaders like Tilak, who ignores kind of this split and asserts nationalism should be built on the appeals of the Hindu majority. He breaks with a lot of the moderates that are demanding this pacifism and peaceful resistance. By demanding boycotts of British goods, he threatens violence if independence wasn't granted. Tilak was actually the first leader with a mass following prior to Gandhi, but it was mostly limited to Bombay and the region around Bombay. He used a lot of reactionary Hindu ideas. It alienated Muslims, moderate Hindus, and a lot of other religious groups. He was actually imprisoned by the British. But I don't want to let his name go by because he was a big proponent of kind of this rise of militant nationalism, which is much different from the emergence of Gandhi. We see that in other areas of the world as well, but your textbook does talk a little bit about Egyptian demands. It actually starts with Egypt and ends with Egypt. So you have the British that occupy Egypt in 1882, and you begin to see Egyptian dissent in the early 1900s. This is when the first nationalist parties are actually formed. In 1906, you have the Dinshui incident, which kind of highlights British arrogance at this time. It talks about the superiority of this relationship, especially since the building and completion of the Suez Canal. It leads to Egyptian nationalism, much of which is militant. By 1913, the British gave in and they grant Egypt representation in the parliament, and World War I distracts the British entirely of what's happening in Egypt. This helps lead to tensions that caused the Egyptian Revolution of 1919. During World War I, the British defend the Suez Canal and all the resources because they're in need of these resources, especially cotton. Remember when we talked about the building in British in Egypt, they want to control that cotton industry, and it becomes about 80%. They control about 80% of what's going through Suez Canal. In 1919, they demand Egyptian representatives at the Paris Peace Conference, and they're denied. So you have the Egyptian Revolution in 1919. This is the revolt against the British occupation in both Egypt and the Sudan. In 1922, Egyptian independence is finally recognized and British withdrawal begins. This is led by the Wafd Party, which is a nationalist liberal political party. It has both pacifist and militant regimes, or factions rather. By 1923, a new constitution changes Egypt from dynastic rule of the Khedives to a parliamentary monarchy that's nationally elected. And you still have the British and their presence with the Suez Canal until 1936. So even though it still has its independence, you have politicians that are concerned with power and wealth over trying to do any kind of social change and trying to get rid of any kind of British influence. That leads to some issues in Egypt itself as well. Then it leads to, and this is where chapter 28 ends, nationalism in the Middle East. After World War I, you have the Ottoman Empire collapsing by 1923. It becomes the Turkish Republic. We'll discuss a lot more about the Armenian genocide that is happening as well, and some of these other ideas like Zionism. But in the League of Nations, the British and French divided the Arab portions of the Ottoman Empire. You have France, who has Syria and Lebanon, Britain, Iraq, Palestine, and Lebanon, and then nationalism begins to grow in these locations, which lead to a lot of the tensions that rise up in the Middle East, especially shortly prior to World War II and especially after World War II. And then the question becomes Palestine and having a Jewish Holy Land. Um, in 1894, you have the Dreyfus Affair, which spurs Jewish Zionists. It's this movement for a Holy Land of some kind. And by 1917, you have the Balfour Declaration. This creates aggravation between Palestinian Arabs and Englishmen. This is something that will lead to much larger issues in the Middle East as we move through the 20th century, especially as Israel becomes its own nation in 1948. So we'll come back to this when we discuss the aftermath of World War II, especially in the Middle East. We'll go back and look at some of the history of the Dreyfus Affair and especially the Balfour Declaration. So based on your textbook and based on this quick information, here's two more and the two last review questions. So pause, make sure that you can at least identify these terms. This brings to an end the presentation on World War I. Again, this is a good presentation to go through. It highlights most of the things that your chapter talks about that are kind of critical for understanding World War I and the aftermath. We'll spend some time this week on Friday talking about the interwar years. And the interwar years will be things like the rise of nationalism, the rise of fascism. We'll discuss briefly the Lost Generation, take a look at Battleship Potemkin, how it gave rise to things like surrealism and existentialism. And then we'll move into discussing World War II. So throughout that, of course, we're discussing the hyperinflation and the rise of Nazi Germany. We're not spending much time on World War II. Many of you have had a lot of exposure on the Holocaust, on World War II specifically. The AP World History Test will never test you on specific battles for World War I or II unless they're major turning points. So we're not spending a lot of time on the battles themselves. It's mostly the lead up to the war and then eventually the aftermath of World War II. And then the following week moves us into the Cold War, and then we'll split apart and begin talking about specifics of certain regions of the world and how the Cold War and post-war world affects those specific regions. So that's all for now. I will see you this week.